The dust swirled in lazy circles around the courthouse steps, carrying with it the scent of defeat and desperation. Tombstone, Arizona Territory, 1887. The sun beat down mercilessly on the gathered crowd, their faces a mix of morbid curiosity and righteous judgment. This wasn't the kind of auction decent folks attended willingly, but economic desperation had a way of blurring moral lines. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Catherine and Margaret O'Sullivan stood side by side on the wooden platform, their identical faces pale beneath the harsh desert sun. At 19, the twins carried themselves with a dignity that their circumstances couldn't diminish. Both wore simple calico dresses that did little to hide their condition. Each was heavy with a child, perhaps 7 months along. Their auburn hair, once carefully braided, now hung loose around their shoulders, and their green eyes held a defiance that spoke of Irish blood and stubborn pride. The auctioneer, a weasel-faced man named Cornelius Briggs, wiped sweat from his brow as he shuffled through his papers. His voice carried the practiced tone of someone who'd sold everything from livestock to human dignity without batting an eye. The territorial laws were clear. Debtors could be sold into indentured servitude to pay their obligations. It was legal, it was brutal, and it was about to destroy 2 young lives. "Ladies and gentlemen," Briggs called out, his voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd, "we have here the O'Sullivan sisters, twin daughters of the late Patrick O'Sullivan, may God rest his soul. Fine stock, these two. Good breeders, as you can plainly see. Strong backs, willing workers. Starting bid is $15 for the pair." Catherine's jaw tightened at the crude assessment. She squeezed her sister's hand, feeling Margaret's fingers tremble despite her outward composure. They'd known this day would come ever since their father's mining claim had been seized for unpaid debts. The territorial government had been swift and merciless, pay up or be sold to cover the obligations. With no family to claim them, and no money to their name, they'd become property of the state. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Most had come out of curiosity rather than intent to bid. Buying pregnant women was a complicated business. You got the labor, but you also inherited the burden of caring for infants, and twins carrying twins? That was double the risk, double the expense. A merchant from the east side of town raised his hand half-heartedly. $16. 18, came another voice, this one from a saloon owner whose reputation preceded him like a bad smell. Margaret's free hand moved protectively to her swollen belly. She'd felt the baby move restlessly all morning, as if sensing the tension in the air. Beside her, Catherine stood straighter, her chin raised in silent defiance. They'd made a pact weeks ago. Whatever happened, they'd face it together. They'd survived their father's drinking, their mother's death in childbirth when they were 12, and the harsh realities of frontier life. They could survive this too. The bidding crept upward with agonizing slowness. $22. 25. The saloon owner dropped out with a disgusted wave of his hand. A rancher from the outskirts considered the pair with calculating eyes before shaking his head and walking away. The merchant remained, but his enthusiasm was waning. $26, Briggs called out, his voice growing impatient. Surely, these fine specimens are worth more than $26. Look at them. Healthy, young, and already proving their fertility. Think of the workers they'll produce in years to come. Catherine felt bile rise in her throat at the crude assessment. They weren't cattle to be bred and worked until they dropped. They were human beings with dreams, fears, and a desperate desire to raise their children with dignity. But in this place, at this moment, they were nothing more than assets to be liquidated. The heat was becoming unbearable. Margaret swayed slightly, her face growing paler by the minute. The stress of the morning, combined with her condition and the relentless sun, was taking its toll. Catherine steadied her sister, whispering words of encouragement that felt hollow. Even as she spoke them, in the crowd, she caught sight of familiar faces, people who'd known their father, who'd shared drinks with him in better times. Now they averted their eyes, unwilling to meet her gaze. Mrs. Henderson from the general store actually turned her back entirely. The banker, Morrison, studied his pocket watch with intense concentration. These people had been neighbors once. Now they were spectators at her family's final humiliation. $28 going once, Briggs announced, mopping his brow again. The merchant looked uncertain, probably calculating the cost of feeding and housing pregnant women against their potential labor value. Margaret's legs buckled slightly. The morning sickness that had plagued her for months chose this moment to return with a vengeance. Catherine caught her sister's arm, supporting her weight while trying to maintain her own composure. They couldn't show weakness now. Not here. Not in front of these people who already saw them as broken, desperate creatures. The silence stretched on, heavy and oppressive. Briggs raised his gavel, preparing to call the sale. $28 going twice. That's when the voice cut through the desert air like a blade through silk. $100. The crowd turned as one, necks craning to see who had spoken. The voice had come from the back of the gathering, deep and steady, carrying an authority that made people step aside without thinking. Through the parting crowd walked a man who commanded attention without trying. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of years under the desert sun. His dark hair was touched with gray at the temples, and his blue eyes were the color of winter sky, cold, distant, but somehow not unkind. He wore simple clothes, dark trousers, a white shirt rolled to the elbows, and boots that had seen honest work. There was nothing flashy about him, nothing that screamed wealth or power. Yet something in his bearing made the crowd fall silent. Briggs nearly dropped his gavel. "Did you say $100, mister?" "Caldwell, James Caldwell." His voice was quiet, but it carried clearly in the sudden hush. "And yes, $100 for both women." The merchant sputtered in protest. "Now see here, that's hardly fair." "I was bidding in good faith." Caldwell's gaze shifted to the merchant, and something in those winter blue eyes made the man's words die in his throat. "Were you planning to outbid me?" The merchant looked down at his feet, mumbling something about highway robbery and unfair practices, but he didn't raise his hand again. Catherine stared at the stranger who just changed their fate with two words and a sum of money that seemed impossibly large. $100 was more than most men in the territory made in a year. Who was he? What did he want with them? And perhaps most importantly, what would he expect in return for such a vast expenditure? Briggs, still in shock at the windfall, managed to stammer out the closing. $100 going once, going twice. Sold. To Mr. James Caldwell. The gavel fell with a sharp crack that seemed to echo through Catherine's chest. It was done. They belonged to this stranger now, this James Caldwell who'd appeared like a ghost from the crowd and bought their lives with pocket change. As the crowd began to disperse, muttering among themselves about the unprecedented sale, Caldwell approached the platform. Up close, Catherine could see the lines around his eyes, the way his hands hung loose at his sides, the careful distance he maintained even as he drew near. This was a man who knew loss, she realized. The recognition hit her like a physical blow. She saw it in the set of his shoulders, the guardedness in his expression, the way he looked at them without really seeing them. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture that was more courtesy than familiarity. His eyes didn't linger on their swollen bellies or assess them like livestock. Instead, he looked at their faces, meeting their eyes like they were people worthy of respect. Margaret found her voice first, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Mr. Caldwell, we're grateful for your intervention. But we should be clear about our circumstances." "I can see your circumstances," he replied simply. And I can see you're about ready to collapse from heat and exhaustion. My wagon's across the street." He didn't wait for their response, simply turned and began walking toward a sturdy wagon hitched to two well-fed horses. Catherine helped Margaret down from the platform, their legs unsteady after standing in the sun for so long. The crowd parted. Before them, some faces curious, others disapproving, most simply indifferent to the drama that had just played out. As they walked, Catherine caught fragments of whispered conversations. $100 for damaged goods. Must be desperate for workers. Twins, having twins. What's the world coming to? Double quotes. Caldwell, single quotes, lost his mind since Martha died. Martha, so there had been a woman in his life, someone whose loss still cast a shadow over him. Catherine filed the information away, along with her growing list of questions about their new owner. The wagon was larger than most, built for hauling supplies rather than passengers, but Caldwell had laid out blankets in the back to make it more comfortable. He helped them up without comment, his touch brief and impersonal, then secured their meager belongings, a small satchel containing their few remaining possessions and their mother's Bible. As he climbed onto the driver's seat and took up the reins, Catherine finally found her voice. "Mr. Caldwell, if I may ask, why did you ... She gestured helplessly, unable to finish the question. He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, without turning around, he said, "Because everyone deserves a chance to start over." The wagon lurched into motion, carrying them away from the courthouse, away from the jeering crowd, away from the life they'd known toward something entirely unknown. Margaret leaned against Catherine's shoulder, exhaustion finally overtaking her now that the immediate crisis had passed. As Tombstone fell away behind them, Catherine studied the back of their rescuer's head, trying to understand what had just happened. James Caldwell had paid more money than she'd ever seen to buy two pregnant Irish twins, with nothing to offer but their labor and their problems. Men didn't make decisions like that out of pure charity. There was always a price, always an expectation. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The desert stretched out before them, endless and unforgiving, much like the uncertain future they were riding toward. In the distance, mountains rose like ancient guardians, their peaks lost in the heat haze. Somewhere out there was Caldwell's ranch, their new home, their new prison, or perhaps their salvation. Only time would tell which. The wagon wheels turned steadily, carrying them toward whatever fate awaited two Irish twins and the mysterious rancher who'd claimed them. Behind them, Tombstone continued its daily business, already forgetting the small drama that had played out in its dusty square. But for Catherine and Margaret O'Sullivan, everything had changed in the space of a heartbeat, and there was no going back. The wagon rolled steadily northward, following a well-worn trail that cut through the sagebrush and mesquite. The afternoon sun had shifted, offering some relief from the morning's brutal heat, but the desert air still shimmered with waves of warmth that made distant objects dance like mirages. Catherine watched the landscape change gradually as they climbed into higher country, the flat, dusty expanse giving way to rolling hills dotted with oak and pine. James Caldwell hadn't spoken since leaving Tombstone, his attention focused on the trail ahead. His silence wasn't hostile, Catherine observed, but rather the quiet of a man accustomed to his own company. Every so often he would glance back to check on them, his expression unreadable beneath the brim of his weather-beaten hat. Margaret had dozed fitfully against Catherine's shoulder, her breathing shallow and irregular. The stress of the morning had taken its toll, and Catherine could feel the tension in her sister's body even in sleep. She stroked Margaret's hair gently, a habit from childhood that still brought comfort to them both. As the wagon crested a small rise, Catherine caught her first glimpse of their destination. The Caldwell Ranch spread across a natural basin, protected on three sides by red rock formations that glowed like burnished copper in the afternoon light. The main house was larger than she'd expected, a two-story structure built of local stone and timber with a wide veranda that wrapped around the front and sides. Outbuildings dotted the property, a large barn, several corrals, a bunkhouse, and what appeared to be a workshop. But it was the garden that caught Catherine's attention. Even from this distance, she could see the neat rows of vegetables, the carefully tended fruit trees, and the splash of color that suggested flower beds. This wasn't the crude homestead of a struggling rancher. This was a place built with intention, maintained with care, and obviously profitable enough to support such an investment. "How long have you lived here?" Catherine asked, breaking the silence that had stretched between them for miles. Caldwell's shoulders tensed slightly, as if the question had struck a nerve. 8 years, he replied after a moment. "I built most of it myself, though I had help with the house." "It's beautiful," she said, and meant it. There was something about the way the buildings nestled into the landscape that spoke of a man who understood the land and worked with it rather than against it. Martha thought so too. The words came out quietly, almost as if he hadn't intended to speak them aloud. Margaret stirred at the sound of voices, blinking slowly as she took in their surroundings. "Oh my," she breathed, her Irish accent more pronounced in her drowsiness. "It's like something from a fairy tale." Caldwell's laugh was short and bitter. "Fairy tales have happy endings, miss. This is just a ranch." As they drew closer, Catherine could make out more details. The corrals held sleek horses rather than the scrubby mustangs common to most frontier ranches. The barn was freshly painted. Its doors hung true and straight. Even the fencing was in excellent repair. Speaking of attention to detail that went beyond mere necessity, a man emerged from the barn as they approached, tall, lean, with skin darkened by years of outdoor work. His black hair was streaked with silver, and his face bore the weathered lines of someone who'd spent a lifetime reading the sky for weather signs. He moved with the easy grace of a man comfortable with horses and cattle, but Catherine noticed the way his hand rested casually near the gun at his hip. "Boss," the man called out, his voice carrying a slight accent that Catherine couldn't immediately place. "Wasn't expecting you back so soon." "Plans changed, Diego," Caldwell replied, bringing the wagon to a stop near the house. "We've got guests." Diego's dark eyes took in the two women with professional assessment, noting their condition, their obvious exhaustion, and the quality of their simple clothes. His expression remained neutral, but Catherine caught the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested surprise, if not disapproval. "Ma'am," Diego said, touching his hat brim in polite acknowledgement. "Ladies." Caldwell climbed down from the driver's seat and moved to help them from the wagon. His hands were gentle but impersonal as he assisted first Margaret, then Catherine to the ground. Both sisters swayed slightly, their legs unsteady after hours of travel on top of the morning's ordeal. "Rosa," Caldwell called toward the house. "Rosa, we need you." The front door opened and a woman emerged, wiping her hands on a flour-dusted apron. She was perhaps 40, with prematurely gray hair pulled back in a practical bun and warm brown eyes that missed nothing. Her dress was simple but well made, and she moved with the efficient grace of someone accustomed to managing a large household. "Dios mio," she breathed, taking in the sight of the two pregnant women. "James, what have you done?" "What needed doing," he replied simply. "They'll need rooms, food, and probably the doctor. Can you manage that?" Rosa's expression shifted from surprise to determination in an instant. "Of course. Come, niñas, you look ready to drop where you stand." She approached the twins with the no-nonsense manner of a woman who'd probably delivered half the babies in the territory. "When are you due?" "October," Catherine replied. "Both of us." 2 months yet, bueno. Time enough to get you properly fed and rested. Rosa took Margaret's arm with gentle firmness. "You first, child. You're pale as milk." As Rosa led Margaret toward the house, Catherine found herself alone with Caldwell and Diego. The two men exchanged a look that carried years of shared understanding. "You sure about this, boss?" Diego asked quietly. "Town's not going to take kindly to you harboring ... Harboring what, Diego? Two women who needed help. You know what I mean. Unmarried women in their condition ... People talk." Caldwell's jaw tightened. "Let them talk. This is my land, my choice." Diego nodded slowly, but Catherine could see the concern in his eyes. "What about the hands? Some of them might not understand." "Then they're welcome to draw their pay and move on. Anyone who can't show respect to guests under my roof doesn't belong here anyway." The exchange revealed more about Caldwell than anything he'd said directly. Here was a man wealthy enough to dismiss workers without concern, powerful enough to ignore social convention, yet careful enough to consider the implications of his actions. Catherine filed away this information, adding it to her growing assessment of their mysterious benefactor. "Miss," Rosa's voice called from the doorway, "your sister is asking for you." Catherine followed Rosa into the house, her eyes adjusting to the cooler interior. The main room was spacious and well-appointed, with furniture that spoke of quality rather than ostentation. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, its mantel adorned with carefully arranged books and a few small photographs. The floors were polished wood covered with colorful rugs that looked hand-woven, but it was the silence that struck Catherine most forcefully. Not the comfortable quiet of a well-run household, but the deeper silence of a place where laughter had once lived but no longer did. There were subtle signs everywhere: a second chair positioned near the fireplace but covered with dust, a woman's shawl draped over a hook by the door as if waiting for its owner's return, a piano in the corner, with sheet music still open to a half-finished song. "This way," Rosa said, leading her down a hallway lined with more photographs. Catherine caught glimpses of a younger Caldwell standing beside a petite blonde woman with kind eyes and a radiant smile. The woman appeared in multiple images, picking flowers in the garden Catherine had admired, standing beside a magnificent bay horse, laughing at something outside the camera's frame. Martha, Catherine realized. This was the woman whose name had made Caldwell's voice go quiet and distant. Rosa stopped at a door near the end of the hallway. "Your sister is here. I've given you the room next door. Both have windows facing the garden. Morning light is good for expecting mothers." Catherine entered to find Margaret already settled on a comfortable bed, her shoes removed and a light blanket pulled over her legs. The room was simply furnished but comfortable, with a washstand, a writing desk, and a rocking chair positioned near the window. "Catherine," Margaret said, relief evident in her voice. "Rosa says we're to stay as long as we need. She's bringing food and hot water for washing." "That's very kind," Catherine replied, though she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to their situation than simple charity. Men like Caldwell didn't spend $100 without expecting something in return. Rosa bustled in carrying a tray laden with food, fresh bread, sliced ham, cheese, and fruit that looked impossibly fresh for the desert climate. Behind her came a young Mexican woman carrying a pitcher of hot water and clean towels. "Eat first," Rosa instructed. "Then rest. Tomorrow we will talk about what comes next." As the women left them alone, Catherine settled into the chair beside Margaret's bed and watched her sister eat with the first genuine appetite she'd shown in weeks. The food was excellent, far better than anything they'd had since their father's death, and Catherine found herself wondering again about Caldwell's true circumstances. "What do you think he wants from us?" Margaret asked quietly, echoing Catherine's thoughts. "I don't know," Catherine admitted. "But Rosa called him James, not Mr. Caldwell, and that man Diego. They talked like old friends, not employer and employee." Maybe he's just lonely, Margaret suggested. This house feels empty, like it's waiting for something. Catherine nodded, thinking of the photographs in the hallway, the covered chair, the piano with its unfinished song. His wife died. Martha, her name was. How do you know? He mentioned her when we first saw the ranch. And there are pictures everywhere. They looked happy. Margaret was quiet for a moment, her hand resting on her swollen belly. Maybe that's why he helped us. Maybe he knows what it's like to lose everything. Before Catherine could respond, there was a soft knock at the door. "Come in," Margaret called. Caldwell stood in the doorway, his hat in his hands and his expression carefully neutral. "I wanted to check that you're settling in all right. Rosa can be intense when she takes someone under her wing." "She's been wonderful," Catherine assured him. "We can't thank you enough for your kindness." "No need for thanks," he replied. "I meant what I said earlier. Everyone deserves a chance to start over." "Mr. Caldwell," Margaret said gently, "we need to be honest about our situation. We have no money to repay you, no family to vouch for us. We understand that you've bought our indenture contracts, and we're prepared to work to earn our keep. But double quotes. But you're both expecting children in 2 months," he finished. "I know. I was there, remember." "Then why?" Catherine asked the question that had been burning in her since the auction finally broke free. Why spend so much money on 2 women who can't possibly earn back their purchase price? Caldwell was quiet for a long moment, his blue eyes distant, as he looked out the window toward the mountains. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because 3 years ago, my wife Martha was carrying our first child. She went into labor during a blizzard, and I couldn't get the doctor here in time." He paused, his knuckles white where they gripped his hat. "She died trying to bring our son into the world. He died with her." The silence that followed was profound, heavy with shared grief and understanding. Catherine felt tears prick her eyes as she saw the pain that Caldwell carried, the guilt that had carved itself into the lines around his eyes. "I couldn't save them," he continued. "But maybe I can help you bring your children safely into the world. Maybe that's worth $100. Margaret reached out instinctively, her hand covering his where it rested on the doorframe. "We're so sorry for your loss." Caldwell looked down at her hand on his, and for a moment his carefully maintained composure cracked. Then he gently pulled away, his emotional walls rebuilding themselves brick by brick. "Get some rest," he said, his voice returning to its earlier neutral tone. "Tomorrow we'll discuss the arrangements. You'll earn your keep, make no mistake, but there's time enough for that when you're both recovered." He left them alone with their thoughts and the growing realization that James Caldwell was far more complicated than he appeared. He wasn't just a wealthy rancher who'd made an impulsive charitable gesture. He was a man haunted by loss, driven by guilt, and perhaps seeking redemption through their salvation. As night fell over the ranch, Catherine lay in her own comfortable bed in the adjacent room, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of her new home. Somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed softly. Closer, she could hear the gentle nickering of horses and the soft footsteps of someone making rounds. Diego, probably, checking on the animals before turning in. For the first time in months, she felt safe. It was a dangerous feeling, she knew. Safety was often an illusion, especially for women in their position. But as she drifted toward sleep, Catherine allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, James Caldwell was exactly what he appeared to be. A good man trying to balance the scales of a universe that had taken too much from all of them. Dawn came quietly to the Caldwell ranch, painting the red rock formations in shades of gold and crimson that took Catherine's breath away. She had risen early, drawn from sleep by unfamiliar bird songs and the distant sound of cattle being moved to pasture. Standing at her bedroom window, she watched as the ranch came alive with purposeful activity. Diego emerged from the bunkhouse with 3 other men, their voices low as they discussed the day's work. She could see Caldwell near the main corral, examining a horse's hoof with the careful attention of someone who understood that a lame animal could mean the difference between profit and loss. The scene had a rhythm to it, a choreographed efficiency that spoke of years of practice. A soft knock interrupted her observations. "Nina?" Rosa's voice called through the door. "Are you awake?" "Come in," Catherine replied, turning from the window. Rosa entered carrying a breakfast tray and wearing the same practical expression she'd shown the night before. "How did you sleep? Any pain or discomfort?" "Very well, thank you. Better than I have in months." Catherine gestured toward the window. "It's beautiful here, peaceful. See, it is a good place. Or it was, before ... Rosa's voice trailed off, and she busied herself arranging the food on the small table near the window. "Your sister is still sleeping. The journey yesterday was hard on her." Catherine accepted the offered breakfast gratefully. Fresh eggs, thick cut, bacon, biscuits still warm from the oven, and coffee that actually tasted like coffee rather than the chicory substitute they'd been forced to drink in their final weeks of poverty. "Rosa, may I ask you something?" "Of course. How long have you worked for Mr. Caldwell?" Rosa settled into the room's other chair, her expression thoughtful. 6 years now. I came here when my husband died. Diego is my brother, you see. James needed someone to manage the house, and I needed work. It was a good arrangement. And Mrs. Caldwell? Martha? Rosa's face softened with memory. Ah, she was something special. Like sunshine in this house, always singing, always finding reasons to smile. She made James laugh, really laugh, not just the polite sounds men make in company. When she died, Rosa shook her head slowly. The light went out of him. For 2 years he barely spoke except to give orders about the ranch work. What changed? You did, Rosa said simply. Yesterday was the first time since Martha's death that I've seen him act on impulse, seen him care about something beyond just surviving another day. Catherine felt a flutter of unease. I hope he doesn't expect us to. That is, we can't replace what he lost. No, child, I don't think that's what this is about. James is not a foolish man. But maybe helping you will help him remember that there's still good to be done in the world. After Rosa left, Catherine made her way to Margaret's room. Her sister was awake, sitting up in bed with a cup of tea and a contemplative expression. You look better, Catherine observed, settling into the bedside chair. I feel better. Rosa brought the doctor earlier, Dr. Henley, a kind man, very thorough. He says both babies are positioned well, and we should have no trouble with the births if we rest properly and eat well. Both babies? Margaret smiled, her hand moving to her belly. He confirmed what Rosa suspected. I'm carrying twins. 2 little ones instead of 1. Catherine stared at her sister in amazement. Twins having twins. What are the odds? Dr. Henley said it runs in families sometimes. Remember how Mother always said her grandmother had been a twin? Before Catherine could respond, there was a commotion outside, raised voices and the sound of horses arriving at speed. Both women moved to the window to see what was happening. A group of riders had arrived in the ranch yard, their horses lathered with sweat and their manner aggressive. At their head rode a man Catherine recognized from the auction, Jeremiah Thompson, the territorial tax assessor, a thin scarecrow of a man with ambitions larger than his abilities. Caldwell, Thompson called out, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. We need to talk. James emerged from the barn, Diego and 2 of the ranch hands flanking him. Even from a distance, Catherine could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand hung loose near his gun belt. Thompson, didn't expect to see you so soon after yesterday's business. That's exactly what we need to discuss. Thompson dismounted, his movements sharp with anger. You made quite a spectacle of yourself in town. $100 for those. Women, my money, my choice. Not when it affects the moral standards of our community. We can't have unmarried women in their condition, flaunting themselves around decent folks. Catherine felt her cheeks burn with anger. They hadn't been flaunting anything. They'd been sold like cattle because of debts they couldn't control. They're not flaunting anything, Caldwell replied, his voice dangerously quiet. They're guests on my property, under my protection. Guests? Thompson laughed harshly. You bought them, Caldwell. That makes them your responsibility, your liability. What happens when those bastard children are born? Are you planning to support them too? The silence that followed was electric with tension. Diego's hand moved toward his weapon, and Catherine could see the ranch hands spreading out slightly, creating better defensive positions without appearing to do so. Those children, Caldwell said with deadly calm, will be welcome here as long as their mothers choose to stay. And I'd be careful with your language, Thompson. I'm not in a charitable mood today. This isn't over, Caldwell. The territorial governor has standards to maintain. We can't have respectable communities corrupted by. Thompson gestured vaguely toward the house. Get off my land, Caldwell said simply. Now. Thompson remounted with obvious reluctance, his face flushed with anger. You're making a mistake, Caldwell. A big one. This territory's changing, becoming civilized. Men like you, harboring women like that, it won't be tolerated much longer. After the unwelcome visitors departed, Catherine and Margaret remained at the window, watching as Caldwell and his men discussed the confrontation in low voices. Finally, James looked up toward their window, seeming to sense their observation. He touched his hat brim in acknowledgement before turning back to his work. We're causing him trouble, Margaret said quietly. We didn't ask to be bought at auction, Catherine replied, though she felt the same concern. But you're right. Our presence here is going to complicate his life. Rosa appeared in the doorway, having obviously witnessed the scene. Don't worry about Thompson. He's been looking for ways to bring James down for years. Jealous of the ranch's success, I think. But we are making things difficult for Mr. Caldwell, Catherine protested. Child, James Caldwell has been making his own decisions for 43 years. If he says you're welcome here, then you're welcome. Thompson and his kind can howl at the moon for all the good it will do them. Later that morning, Catherine ventured outside for the first time since their arrival. The ranch was even more impressive up close. Every building well maintained, every piece of equipment properly cared for. She found herself in the garden. Rosa had tended, marveling at the variety of vegetables and herbs growing in the desert climate. Impressive, isn't it? Catherine turned to find Diego approaching, his hat in his hands and his expression friendly but cautious. Very much so. How do you manage to grow all this in such a dry country? Water rights, Diego replied. James bought up claims along the creek that runs through the valley. Gives us irrigation for the garden and water for the cattle year-round. Smart thinking. Most ranchers struggle through the dry seasons. Catherine studied the neat rows of corn, beans, and squash. This must feed the entire ranch. And then some. Rosa preserves what we don't use fresh. Trades surplus with neighbors for things we can't grow ourselves. Diego paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. You know, Senora, the boss hasn't shown interest in much of anything since Martha died. Seeing him take action yesterday, it was good to witness. I hope we don't disappoint him. I don't think you will. Martha always said this place needed the sound of children's laughter. Maybe that's what's coming. They were interrupted by the fun arrival of another visitor, though this one was clearly welcome. A buggy approached the house, driven by an elderly woman in a dark blue dress and practical bonnet. She handled the reins with the competence of someone accustomed to frontier travel. James emerged from the house to greet the new arrival, his manner respectful but warm. Mrs. Patterson, thank you for coming. Nonsense, James. When Rosa's message said you had guests who might need a woman's advice, of course I came. The elderly woman accepted his help from the buggy with dignity. "Where are these young ladies?" "I've heard about." Catherine and Margaret were summoned to the parlor, where they found themselves under the shrewd but kindly assessment of Eleanor Patterson, widow of the territory's former Indian agent and unofficial matriarch of the scattered ranch community. "Well," Mrs. Patterson said after introductions were made, "you're certainly not what I expected after hearing Jeremiah Thompson ranting in the Mercantile this morning. What was he saying?" Catherine asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. "Oh, the usual nonsense about fallen women and moral corruption. The man sees sin in a Sunday sunrise." Mrs. Patterson accepted a cup of tea from Rosa with a grateful nod. "The truth is, my dears, you've landed in one of the few places in the territory where you'll be treated with proper respect." "What do you mean?" Margaret asked. "James Caldwell is what we used to call old school. Believes in protecting those who can't protect themselves, honoring his word once given, and judging people by their actions rather than their circumstances." Mrs. Patterson sipped her tea thoughtfully. "His father was the same way, helped establish the first schools in the territory, served as an unofficial judge before we had proper courts." "And people respect that?" Catherine asked. "Some do. Others resent it, makes them feel small by comparison. But James has enough influence and enough ready cash that most folks keep their opinions to themselves." Mrs. Patterson stayed for lunch, regaling them with stories of the territories, early days, and offering practical advice about childbirth on the frontier. She also brought news from other ranches whose cattle were thriving, which homesteaders were struggling, who was getting married or divorced or buried. "The Hendersons' oldest girl is expecting her third," she mentioned casually. "Sarah Morrison's been helping with the deliveries in our area since Dr. Henley can't be everywhere at once. Capable woman, very discreet. I'll make sure she knows about your situation." When Mrs. Patterson prepared to leave, she took Catherine aside for a private word. "My dear, I want you to understand something. What James did yesterday, buying your freedom, bringing you here, it's not charity in the usual sense. This is a man trying to balance the books with fate itself. He couldn't save his own wife and child, but maybe he can save you and yours. Mrs. Patterson, we don't want to be anyone's project for redemption." "Good. That's exactly the right attitude. But don't mistake his motives for pity. James Caldwell doesn't do anything out of pity. He acts from a sense of justice. There's a difference." That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, Catherine found herself on the front porch, watching the daily routine of the ranch wind down. James was in the main corral, working with a young horse that clearly needed training. His movements were patient, consistent, gradually earning the animal's trust through repetition and gentle persistence. Margaret joined her, moving slowly but with more energy than she'd shown in weeks. "Rosa says Mr. Caldwell built that rocking chair himself," Margaret observed, settling carefully into the chair in question. "Made it for Martha when she was expecting." Catherine watched as James continued his work with the horse, noting the quiet competence in every gesture. "He's not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Someone harder, I suppose. More demanding. Men who buy women at auctions usually want something specific in return." "Maybe he does want something," Margaret said thoughtfully. "Maybe he wants to prove that not every story has to end in tragedy." As if sensing their observation, James looked toward the porch and raised his hand in a brief wave. Then he turned back to his work, continuing the patient process of building trust with a creature that had every reason to be afraid. The parallel wasn't lost on either sister. Like the young horse, they were learning to trust again, one day at a time, under the patient care of a man who seemed to understand that some healing couldn't be rushed. 3 weeks into their stay at the Caldwell Ranch, Catherine woke to the sound of shouting from the direction of the bunkhouse. She moved to her window, peering through the pre-dawn darkness to see figures moving with urgent purpose near the corrals. Even in the dim light, She could tell something was seriously wrong. She dressed quickly and made her way to the kitchen, where Rosa was already preparing what looked like enough coffee for an army. "What's happening?" Catherine asked, accepting. "A cup of the strong brew. Trouble with the cattle. Someone cut the fence lines during the night. The herd scattered into the canyon country. James and the men rode out an hour ago to try to round them up before they get too far into the rough terrain." Through the kitchen window, Catherine could see the empty corrals that should have held nearly 200 heads of prime cattle. Economic implications were staggering. Those animals represented months of careful breeding and feeding, thousands of dollars of investment that could disappear into the vast wilderness if not recovered quickly. Who would do such a thing? Catherine asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Someone who wants to see James fail," Rosa replied grimly. "Or someone who wants to send a message about harboring undesirable elements." Margaret appeared in the doorway, drawn by the activity. Despite her advancing pregnancy, she'd been making herself useful around the ranch, helping Rosa with cooking, mending clothes, and keeping the household accounts. The work seemed to agree with her. She'd gained healthy weight, and her color had much improved. "Any word from the search party?" Margaret asked. "Not yet. But James knows this country better than any man alive. If anyone can bring those cattle home, it's him." The day stretched endlessly as they waited for news. Catherine found herself unable to concentrate on any task, constantly listening for the sound of hoofbeats that might signal the men's return. Margaret tried to maintain normal routines, but Catherine could see the worry in her sister's eyes. It was Diego who brought the first update, arriving alone in late afternoon with dust coating his clothes and exhaustion lining his face. "We found most of them," he reported, accepting Rosa's offer of food and water. "About 30 head are still missing, probably pushed deeper into the canyon by whoever did this. James and 2 of the boys are still tracking them. Any sign of who was responsible?" Catherine asked. Diego's expression darkened. "Boot prints near the cut fence, and we found this." He produced a brass button from his pocket, the kind used on military-style jackets. Territorial militia uses buttons like this. The implications hung heavy in the air. If territorial authorities were behind the sabotage, this was far more serious than simple harassment. It suggested an organized effort to drive James from his land or force him to abandon his protection of the twins. "What does this mean for Mr. Caldwell?" Margaret asked. Quietly, "It means he's made enemies in high places," Diego replied. "And those kinds of enemies don't give up easily." James didn't return until well after dark, leading a small group of recovered cattle and wearing the grim expression of a man who'd spent 12 hours dealing with deliberate malice. Catherine watched from the kitchen window as he saw to his horse's care before finally making his way to the house. She met him at the door with hot coffee and a plate of food Rosa had kept warm. He accepted both gratefully, settling into a chair at the kitchen table with a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. "How bad is it?" Catherine asked gently. "Could have been worse." "We got most of them back. Lost maybe 20 head too. The canyon country. But it's not really about the cattle." "What do you mean?" James looked up at her with eyes that had seen too much. "Whoever did this knows my routines, knows which fences to cut to cause maximum damage. This wasn't random vandalism. It was planned by someone familiar with the ranch." The thought that sent a chill through Catherine. Someone you trusted? Or someone who's been watching us for weeks, learning our patterns? James pushed food around his plate without eating. "Either way, it means we're dealing with people who are serious about making trouble." Margaret entered the kitchen, moving carefully but determinedly. "Mr. Caldwell, we can't help but feel responsible for this. If our presence here is causing you this kind of difficulty—" "Stop right there," James interrupted, his voice firm but not unkind. "You didn't cut my fences. You didn't scatter my cattle. And you're not responsible for the actions of small-minded People who think they can intimidate me into abandoning what's right. But surely you must see that our being here complicates your life, Catherine persisted. Thompson made that clear. When he visited, James was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup as if it might hold answers to questions he'd been avoiding. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of decisions made in darkness and solitude. 3 years ago, when Martha was dying, she made me promise something. She said this ranch was too big for one man, too quiet for one person. She made me swear that if I ever had the chance to fill it with life again, with laughter and children's voices, I wouldn't let fear or convention stop me. He looked up at both women, his blue eyes holding a determination Catherine hadn't seen before. I made that promise to a dying woman, and I intend to keep it. Whatever trouble comes from having you here, we'll face it together. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor in the form of Dr. Henley, arriving earlier than his usual weekly check on the twins' health. His normally cheerful demeanor was subdued as Rosa led him into the parlor where Catherine and Margaret waited. "Ladies," he said, settling his medical bag carefully beside his chair, "I'm afraid I have some concerning news. There's been talk in town, organized talk about petitioning the territorial governor to investigate the situation here." "What kind of investigation?" Catherine asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Claims of moral corruption, improper cohabitation, potential violations of territorial law regarding the treatment of indentured persons." Dr. Henley removed his spectacles and cleaned them with obvious nervousness. "I want you to understand. I don't personally give credence to any of these accusations, but the people making them have influence." Margaret's hand moved protectively to her belly. "What would happen if the governor decided to investigate?" "Best case scenario, you'd be relocated to the territorial home for unwed mothers in Phoenix. Worst case." He left the sentence unfinished, but the implication was clear. "And Mr. Caldwell?" Catherine asked. "Could face charges of corrupting public morals, possibly lose his territorial water rights, maybe even forfeit portions of his land grants." Dr. Henley replaced his spectacles with a sigh. "I've known James for 8 years, delivered his wife. When she well, he's a good man who's been through enough tragedy. I hate to see him facing more trouble." After the doctor left, Catherine found herself walking the ranch grounds, trying to process the growing complications their presence had created. She ended up at the small cemetery behind the house, where 2 simple headstones marked the graves of Martha Caldwell and the son who had died with her. James found her there as the sun was setting, the red rocks glowing like embers in the fading light. "I come here most evenings," he said simply, settling onto the wooden bench he'd placed between the graves. "Talk to them sometimes when I'm trying to work through difficult decisions." Catherine sat beside him, careful to maintain respectful distance. "What did you tell them today?" "That I'm scared," he admitted. "Not of Thompson or his political friends, but of failing again, of making promises I can't keep." "You haven't failed anyone, haven't I? I promised Martha I'd keep her safe, and she died in our bed while I watched helplessly. I promised our son a chance at life, and he never drew breath." James's voice was steady, but Catherine could hear the pain beneath the controlled words. "Now I've promised you and Margaret protection, and already there are people plotting to take you away. Some promises are beyond human power to keep." Catherine said gently, "You can't control illness or politics or the cruelty of others. You can only control your own actions. And if my actions aren't enough?" Catherine was quiet for a moment, thinking of all the ways their lives had changed since that terrible day in Tombstone. "Mr. Caldwell, James, you gave us hope when we had none. You treated us with dignity when the world saw us as disposable. Whatever happens next, that gift can't be taken away." They sat in comfortable silence as stars began appearing in the darkening sky. Finally, James spoke again. "There's something you should know. About the ranch, about why it matters so much to me. You don't owe us explanations. Maybe not, but you deserve to understand what you're caught up in. James gestured toward the land stretching away from them. This ranch isn't just my home, it's my father's legacy. He came here in 1851, when this was still Mexican territory. Built everything from nothing, fought off Apache raids, survived droughts that killed most of the other settlers. Catherine waited, sensing there was more to the story. When he died, he left me more than just land. He left me the responsibility to use it well, to make it a place that contributed something positive to the world. That's why I've always hired men others wouldn't give a chance, former soldiers with drinking problems, Mexican workers fleeing violence, even a couple of former outlaws who wanted to go straight. And that's why you helped us, partly, but also because... James paused, seeming to struggle with the words. When I saw you two on that platform, I saw Martha. Not physically, but the same kind of dignity in the face of impossible circumstances. The same refusal to surrender, even when everything seemed lost. The comparison took Catherine's breath away. To be compared to his beloved wife, even in such terms, felt like both an honor and a burden. There's going to be a confrontation, James continued. Thompson and his allies aren't going to be satisfied with scattered cattle and veiled threats. They're building towards something bigger. What kind of confrontation? I don't know yet. But I want you to understand that when it comes, you'll have choices to make. I won't force you to stay if leaving seems safer. Your safety, and the safety of your children, comes before my promises or my pride. Catherine turned to face him fully, seeing the man who'd paid a fortune for their freedom, who'd opened his home without questions, who'd risked his reputation and now his livelihood to keep his word to a dying wife. James Caldwell, she said firmly, we're not going anywhere. Whatever storm is coming, we'll weather it together. That night, as Catherine lay awake listening to the night sounds of the ranch, she reflected on how much had changed since their arrival. They'd gone from being purchased property to being family members, from being burdens to being people worth fighting for. The transition hadn't been without complications, but it felt real in a way that nothing had since their father's death. Outside her window, she could see light still burning in James's study, where he was probably working on plans to protect them all from whatever Thompson and his allies were planning. The sight filled her with a mixture of gratitude and determination that tomorrow would bring new challenges. But tonight they were safe, warm, and surrounded by people who cared about their welfare. For women who'd stood on an auction block just weeks earlier, that transformation felt nothing short of miraculous. In the room next door, she could hear Margaret moving restlessly, probably experiencing the same mixture of hope and anxiety that kept Catherine awake. Soon, they would both be mothers, their children born into this strange new family that defied conventional definitions, but felt more solid than anything they'd known since childhood. Whatever came next, they would face it as the O'Sullivan twins. Always had, together, stubborn and determined to survive. But now they wouldn't be facing it alone. The morning of September 15th began like any other, but Catherine would later remember it as the day their fragile peace shattered completely. She was in the garden with Rosa, harvesting the last of the summer vegetables, when the sound of multiple horses approaching at speed sent them both toward the house. A formal procession rode into the ranch yard, 12 men in dark suits and territorial militia uniforms, led by a figure Catherine didn't recognize. He was a tall, severe-looking man with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to having his orders followed without question. Behind him rode Thompson, wearing a smug expression that made Catherine's blood run cold. James emerged from the barn, Diego and 4 ranch hands flanking him. Even outnumbered, there was something in his posture that suggested he wasn't intimidated by the show of force. "Mr. Caldwell," the silver-haired man called out, his voice carrying the authority of office. "I am Colonel Harrison Blackwood, Special Investigator for the Territorial Governor. I have a warrant to inspect this property and interview its residents. James walked forward slowly, his hands visible but ready. On what grounds, Colonel? Complaints have been filed regarding violations of territorial moral statutes, improper management of indentured persons, and potential corruption of public welfare. Blackwood produced a folded document from his coat. This gives me full authority to examine your operations and determine if territorial intervention is necessary. Catherine felt Margaret's hand slip into hers as they watched from the kitchen window. Both women were now clearly showing their advanced pregnancies, and Catherine could only imagine how they appeared to these stern-faced officials, living proof of whatever moral corruption they'd come to investigate. I'd like to see that warrant, James said calmly. Blackwood handed over the document with obvious satisfaction. James read it carefully, his expression growing darker with each line. Finally, he looked up at the assembled officials. This warrant gives you the right to inspect ranch operations for compliance with territorial labor laws. It says nothing about harassing my guests or interfering with private family matters. Mr. Caldwell, Thompson interjected, his voice oily with false concern. These women were purchased at a legal auction. That makes them indentured servants under territorial law, subject to specific regulations regarding their treatment and living conditions. They were freed from their indenture contracts the day after the auction, James replied evenly. They remain here as invited guests. Blackwood's eyebrows rose in obvious skepticism. You're claiming you spent $100 to purchase these women and then immediately freed them. For what purpose? Personal charity, which is neither illegal nor subject to territorial oversight. I'm afraid that's where you're wrong, Blackwood said, signaling to his men. Sergeant Murphy, begin the inspection. I want to see living quarters, financial records, and documentation of any contractual arrangements. James stepped forward, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. Colonel, you're welcome to inspect the ranch operations as your warrant allows. But my guests' private quarters are off limits unless you have a specific court order. Your guests? Blackwood laughed harshly. Mr. Caldwell, we both know what these women are. Unwed mothers carrying bastard children, living in sin under your roof. The territorial government cannot permit such flagrant violations of public morality. The insult hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Catherine saw James's hands clench into fists, saw Diego's subtle shift toward his weapon, felt the sudden tension that suggested violence was only seconds away. But it was Margaret who broke the silence, stepping out onto the porch with the dignity of a queen despite her condition. Colonel Blackwood, she said in her clear Irish accent, I am Margaret O'Sullivan, and I take exception to your characterization of my sister and myself. We are here by choice, as guests of Mr. Caldwell, and under the protection of territorial law regarding the treatment of expectant mothers. Blackwood turned his cold gaze on her, clearly surprised by her composure and articulate response. Miss O'Sullivan, territorial law also has provisions regarding moral conduct and the corruption of public welfare. Your situation presents a clear challenge to community standards. My situation, as you call it, is the result of circumstances beyond my control. Mr. Caldwell offered assistance when we had nowhere else to turn. If that's corruption, then perhaps your community standards need examination. Catherine felt a surge of pride at her sister's courage, even as she feared the consequences of such bold words. These men had come looking for evidence of wrongdoing, and Margaret's defiance might be exactly what they needed to justify harsh action. Thompson stepped forward with obvious glee. You see, Colonel, this is exactly the kind of brazen behavior that concerned citizens brought to our attention. These women show no shame, no recognition of their improper status. What exactly would you have us be ashamed of? Catherine found herself asking as she joined Margaret on the porch. Surviving? Accepting help when it was offered? Preparing to bring new life into the world? Blackwood studied both women with calculating eyes. The shame, Miss O'Sullivan, should be in accepting charity from a man to whom you can offer nothing of value in return. It creates ... implications about the nature of your arrangement. The accusation was clear, even if not spoken directly. Catherine felt her cheeks burn with anger at the suggestion that they were paying for James's protection with sexual favors. "Colonel Blackwood," James said, his voice deadly quiet, "I'm going to give you one chance to apologize for that implication. After that, warrant or no warrant, you'll be leaving my property." Blackwood smiled coldly. "Are you threatening a territorial official, Mr. Caldwell?" "I'm protecting the honor of ladies under my roof. Something a gentleman would understand." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. Catherine could see the militiamen shifting nervously, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the confrontation was taking. But before anyone could draw weapons, another voice cut through the tension. "Colonel Blackwood!" What an unexpected surprise! Everyone turned to see Mrs. Patterson approaching in her buggy, her expression pleasantly neutral, but her eyes sharp with intelligence. Behind her rode two other women Catherine recognized from church gatherings, Mrs. Morrison, the banker's wife, and Susan Henley, the doctor's daughter. "Mrs. Patterson," Blackwood replied stiffly, "this is official territorial business." "Of course it is, dear. I'm sure you won't mind if we observe. As concerned citizens of the territory, we have every right to witness how our officials conduct their duties." The arrival of respectable community women clearly complicated Blackwood's plans. Whatever rough treatment he might have intended couldn't be carried out in front of witnesses who would report back to their husbands and neighbors. "Furthermore," Mrs. Patterson continued sweetly, "I believe territorial law requires that any investigation of women's living conditions be conducted with female observers present. For propriety's sake, you understand." Thompson's face reddened with frustration. "Eleanor, this is hardly the time for your social reform crusading. On the contrary, Jeremiah, this seems exactly the time to ensure that territorial law is followed properly." Mrs. Patterson climbed down from her buggy with the help of Susan Henley. "After all, we wouldn't want there to be any questions about the legitimacy of your investigation." Blackwood clearly recognized that his surprise attack had been neutralized by the presence of influential community members. With obvious reluctance, he signaled his men to begin a more restrained inspection of the ranch facilities. What followed was an hour of barely controlled hostility, as the investigators poked through every building on the property. They examined the bunkhouse, counted cattle, reviewed James's financial records, and questioned ranch hands about working conditions. But under the watchful eyes of Mrs. Patterson and her companions, they maintained at least a veneer of official propriety. Catherine and Margaret remained on the porch throughout the inspection, their presence a silent challenge to anyone who might question their right to be there. James stood nearby, answering questions when required, but offering no more information than legally necessary. Finally, Blackwood concluded his examination and returned to the main house. His expression suggested he'd found nothing that could support serious charges, but his manner remained hostile. "Mr. Caldwell," he announced formally, "while I find no direct violations of territorial labor statutes, the situation here remains ... irregular. I'm recommending to the governor that this property be placed under periodic monitoring to ensure continued compliance with territorial standards." "What does that mean exactly?" James asked. "Monthly inspections, reports on the status of your ... guests ... and immediate notification if any changes occur in their circumstances." Blackwood's smile was thin and cold. "The territory has an interest in ensuring that public morality is maintained." Thompson stepped forward eagerly. "And if violations are found during these inspections, then appropriate action will be taken to protect territorial interests." Blackwood replied, "Including removal of corrupting influences and potential forfeiture of properties used to facilitate immoral activities. The threat was clear enough. They would be watching, waiting for any excuse to intervene. One misstep, one perceived violation of their arbitrary moral standards, and everything James had built could be destroyed. But Mrs. Patterson wasn't finished. "Colonel Blackwood, I trust you'll be conducting similar investigations of other properties in the territory? After all, if moral standards are your concern, there are several establishments in Tombstone alone that might warrant your attention." "This investigation is specific to complaints received about this property," Blackwood replied stiffly. "How curious. One might wonder about the motivations behind such specific complaints." Mrs. Patterson's voice remained sweetly innocent, but her meaning was clear. Perhaps the territorial governor would be interested in understanding why certain citizens are so focused on this particular ranch. The verbal chess match continued for several more minutes, with Mrs. Patterson skillfully highlighting the political nature of the investigation, while maintaining her tone of helpful cooperation. By the time Blackwood finally ordered his men to mount up, it was clear that his mission had not achieved its intended goals. "Mr. Caldwell," Blackwood said as he prepared to leave, "I trust you understand that the territorial government will be watching your operations closely. Any hint of impropriety will result in immediate action." "Colonel," James replied evenly, "I understand that some people will always find fault with acts of simple human decency. But I also understand that the territorial government was established to protect citizens, not to persecute them for showing kindness to those in need." After the officials departed, the women who had arrived to observe gathered on the porch with Rosa serving coffee and trying to lighten the oppressive mood that lingered over the ranch. "Well," Mrs. Patterson said with satisfaction, "that was quite educational. Blackwood overplayed his hand rather badly, I thought." "How so?" Catherine asked. "Too much bluster, too little substance. If they had real evidence of wrongdoing, they wouldn't need such theatrical displays. This was intimidation, pure and simple." Susan Henley nodded agreement. "Father says the territorial governor has been under pressure from Eastern interests to clean up frontier communities. Apparently, investors worry that lawless territories discourage settlement." "But we're not lawless," Margaret protested. "No, dear, but you're inconvenient," Mrs. Morrison explained gently. "Your presence here challenges certain assumptions about how things should be done. That makes some people nervous." As the afternoon wore on and their supporters gradually departed, Catherine found herself alone with James in his study. The room felt heavy with unspoken concerns about what the day's events meant for their future. "They'll be back," James said quietly, staring out the window toward the mountains where shadows were beginning to lengthen. "Yes," Catherine agreed. "The question is whether we'll be ready for them." James turned to look at her, his blue eyes holding a mixture of determination and concern. "Catherine, I need you to understand something. What happened today was just the opening move. They're going to keep pushing, keep looking for excuses to take action against us. It's going to get worse before it gets better. Are you asking us to leave? I'm asking you to think carefully about what you're willing to endure for the sake of staying here. Because if you choose to stay, you're choosing to fight a battle that could destroy everything we've all worked to build." Catherine was quiet for a long moment, thinking about the comfortable life they'd found here, the safety they'd discovered, the sense of belonging that had grown slowly but surely over the past months. Then she thought about the alternative. Returning to a world that saw them as disposable, raising their children without the protection and support they'd found here. "James," she said finally, "we've been fighting for survival our entire lives. If we have to fight for the right to live with dignity, surrounded by people who care about us, then that's a battle worth having." Outside, the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold that reminded Catherine of the morning she'd first seen the ranch. So much had changed since that day, But the beauty of this place remained constant. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats to the fragile sanctuary they'd created. But tonight they were still together, still standing, still refusing to surrender to forces that would rather see them broken than free. The war for their future had begun in earnest, but Catherine found herself oddly confident about the outcome. They had something their enemies lacked, the unshakable certainty that comes from fighting for what's right rather than what's convenient. October arrived with an unseasonable cold that turned the morning air sharp and crystalline. Catherine stood at her bedroom window, watching frost glitter on the garden vegetables like scattered diamonds. Her reflection in the glass showed a woman transformed, no longer the desperate creature who'd stood on an auction block, but someone who belonged in this place, this life they'd all fought to build. The month since Blackwood's investigation had passed in deceptive quiet. True to his word, territorial inspectors arrived regularly, poking through ranch operations with suspicious eyes, but finding nothing to justify their obvious desire for intervention. James met each visit with calm professionalism, Rosa maintained her household with flawless efficiency, and the twins continued their daily routines with the dignity that had first caught Mrs. Patterson's admiration. But Catherine had learned to read the subtle signs of tension in the people around her. James spent longer hours in his study, correspondence arriving and departing with unusual frequency. Diego kept the ranch hands closer to the main buildings, and even Rosa seemed to listen more carefully to the sounds beyond the kitchen window. Babies were due any day now. Dr. Henley had confirmed that both twins were carrying healthy children. Though Margaret's situation remained complicated by her condition, twin babies positioning themselves for birth in a way that might require surgical intervention unavailable in frontier medicine. It was Margaret who first spotted the dust cloud approaching from the east, much larger than the usual inspection parties that had become an unwelcome routine. "Catherine," she called from the parlor where she'd been attempting to read despite her discomfort. "I think you should see this." Catherine joined her sister at the front window, her heart sinking at the sight of what appeared to be a small army riding toward the ranch. At least 30 men, including several wagons and what looked like a field artillery piece. This wasn't an inspection. This was an occupation force. James emerged from the barn at the first sound of hoofbeats, Diego and the ranch hands quickly forming up behind him. But even Catherine could see that 6 men, no matter how skilled or determined, couldn't stand against such overwhelming numbers. Colonel Blackwood rode at the head of the column, his expression grim with satisfaction. Beside him rode a figure that made Catherine's blood run cold, Judge Marcus Thornfield, the territorial magistrate, known for his harsh sentences and rigid interpretation of moral law. "Mr. Caldwell," Blackwood called out as the force came to a halt in the ranch yard. "By order of the territorial governor and Judge Thornfield, this property is hereby placed under direct territorial administration pending resolution of serious criminal charges." James walked forward slowly, his hands visible but his posture suggesting a man prepared for violence despite impossible odds. "What charges, Colonel?" Judge Thornfield urged his horse forward, producing a formal document from his saddlebags. His voice carried the pompous authority of a man who'd never doubted his own righteousness. "Corruption of public morals, conspiracy to violate territorial statutes, and harboring fugitives from lawful authority." "Fugitives?" James's voice carried genuine confusion. "What fugitives?" "The women you claim to be protecting," Thornfield replied coldly. "It has come to our attention that Catherine and Margaret O'Sullivan were sold at auction to satisfy legitimate debts, making them bound servants under territorial law. Your supposed freeing of these women constitutes theft of lawfully purchased property." Catherine felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Somehow they had found a legal mechanism to claim that James's act of charity was actually criminal. The elegant trap spoke of careful planning and legal expertise far beyond Thompson's capabilities. "Judge Thornfield," James said carefully, I have documentation proving that I purchased and immediately freed both women, according to territorial statute. There was no theft, no violation of law. Mr. Caldwell, territorial statute requires that the freeing of indentured servants be registered with the territorial magistrate within 10 days of the transaction. Your documentation shows no such registration. Thornfield's smile was as cold as the morning air. Therefore, these women remain bound servants who have been unlawfully harbored and corrupted. The legal technicality was breathtaking in its cynical precision. Someone had researched territorial law extensively, looking for exactly this kind of procedural trap that could retroactively criminalize James's actions. Furthermore, Thornfield continued, medical examination reveals that both women are in advanced pregnancy, suggesting that their corruption has continued under your roof. This constitutes additional charges of moral turpitude and violation of territorial standards. Catherine stepped onto the porch, Margaret beside her despite the obvious risk. If they were going to be condemned, they would face their accusers with dignity. Judge Thornfield, Catherine said clearly, we are not bound servants. We are free women who have committed no crimes except surviving circumstances beyond our control. Miss O'Sullivan, you are indentured servants who have fled your lawful obligations and corrupted a respected member of this community. Your pregnancies provide evidence of the moral degradation that has occurred here. Our pregnancies occurred before we ever met Mr. Caldwell, Margaret said firmly. He has shown us nothing but kindness and respect. Thornfield's laugh was harsh and dismissive. Young woman, no man spends $100 on pregnant strangers out of mere kindness. Your presence here speaks to an arrangement that violates both law and decency. The accusation hung in the air like poison. Catherine saw James's face darken with anger at the implication that he had purchased them for sexual purposes. Judge, James said with deadly quiet, you're accusing me of crimes that exist only in your imagination. I have witnesses to my conduct, documentation of my actions, and the support of respected community members. Community support that is conspicuously absent today, Blackwood observed with satisfaction. Interesting how quickly people abandon associations that might reflect poorly on their own reputations. It was true. The ranch yard that should have been filled with allies contained only territorial forces and the small group of people who lived and worked on the property, Mrs. Patterson, Dr. Henley, and the other community members who had shown support were nowhere to be seen. What do you want? James asked bluntly. Thornfield smiled with the satisfaction of a man who held all the cards. Justice, Mr. Caldwell. The women will be transported to the territorial facility in Phoenix, where they can receive proper moral instruction while serving out their lawful indenture contracts. You will face trial for your various crimes during which this property will remain under territorial administration, and if I refuse to cooperate, then you will be arrested immediately for resisting lawful authority, and the women will be taken by force. Thornfield gestured toward the armed men surrounding the ranch buildings. I trust you won't force us to resort to such unpleasant measures. Catherine felt Margaret sway beside her, and steadied her sister with one hand while her mind raced through their impossible options. They could flee, but pregnant women on foot couldn't outrun armed horsemen. They could fight, but 6 ranch hands against 30 soldiers would be suicide. They could submit, but that meant separation, imprisonment, and the destruction of everything they'd built. That's when the unexpected sound of more horses approaching drew everyone's attention toward the road. But these weren't more territorial forces. These were local ranchers, townspeople, and community members, riding hard toward the ranch with the urgency of people responding to an emergency. Mrs. Patterson led the group, her usually neat appearance disheveled from hard riding. Behind her came Dr. Henley, the blacksmith Thomas Morrison, shopkeeper Samuel Richardson, and at least 20 others, including several ranch families with their older children. Judge Thornfield, Mrs. Patterson called out as she reined in her horse. What is the meaning of this military occupation? Thornfield's confidence faltered slightly at the unexpected arrival of so many witnesses. Mrs. Patterson, this is territorial business. Legal proceedings that don't require civilian involvement. Legal proceedings that involve respected members of our community absolutely require civilian witness, Mrs. Patterson replied firmly, particularly when those proceedings appear to be conducted in violation of due process. Dr. Henley dismounted and approached the porch where Catherine and Margaret stood. Ladies, are you well? We came as soon as word reached town about the territorial forces moving against the ranch. How did you know? Catherine asked. Diego sent his nephew to town at first light, Mrs. Patterson explained. The boy rode to every ranch and business, telling people that James Caldwell was about to be arrested on false charges. Thornfield's face reddened with anger. Mrs. Patterson, you are interfering with legal proceedings. I could have you arrested for obstruction of justice. Judge Thornfield, I am observing legal proceedings, as is my right as a territorial citizen, Mrs. Patterson replied sweetly. Unless you're suggesting that territorial law no longer guarantees the right of citizens to witness the administration of justice? The arrival of community support had clearly disrupted whatever plans Thornfield and Blackwood had made. What was supposed to be a swift, decisive action had become a public spectacle, with dozens of witnesses who could report on any irregularities or excessive force. But Thornfield was not easily deterred. Very well. Let these good people witness. Justice being served. Mr. Caldwell, you have exactly 1 hour to gather your personal effects before being transported to Tombstone for trial. The women will be prepared for immediate transport to Phoenix. No, the word came from James with such finality that even the armed soldiers seemed to take notice. I will not permit you to separate these women from medical care when they're both so close to delivery. It would endanger their lives and the lives of their children. Mr. Caldwell, you are in no position to permit or forbid anything. Blackwood interjected. These women are territorial property, subject to disposal as the court sees fit. They are human beings under my protection, and I will not allow them to be transported in their condition. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. Catherine could see James calculating odds, weighing options, preparing for what might be his final stand. She could see Diego and the ranch hands shifting positions, creating better defensive angles despite being hopelessly outnumbered. But it was Margaret who broke the silence, stepping forward with a grace that belied her advanced pregnancy. Judge Thornfield, she said clearly, her Irish accent lending dignity to her words, I invoke Territorial Statute 847 regarding the treatment of expectant mothers in custody disputes. Thornfield blinked in surprise. I beg your pardon? Territorial Statute 847, Margaret repeated, her voice growing stronger. No woman in advanced pregnancy may be forcibly relocated except in cases of immediate physical danger, and then only with medical supervision. Furthermore, any custody proceedings involving pregnant women must include medical testimony regarding the risks of proposed actions. Dr. Henley stepped forward with obvious admiration. The young lady is correct, Judge. Territorial law absolutely prohibits the forced transport of women so close to delivery. As the attending physician, I would be required to testify that such transport would constitute negligent endangerment. Catherine stared at her sister in amazement. Where had Margaret learned territorial law? How had she known exactly which statute would apply? The answer came from Mrs. Patterson, whose proud smile suggested she'd been busy during the months since Blackwood's investigation. I took the liberty of ensuring that all concerned parties understood their legal rights under the territorial statute. Amazing how much law one can learn from the territorial courthouse library. Thornfield looked trapped between his determination to proceed and the growing realization that his carefully planned legal maneuver was unraveling in front of dozens of witnesses who were clearly better informed than he'd anticipated. "This is a temporary delay at best," he said finally. "Once these women have delivered their children, they will be immediately transported to serve their lawful indenture. And Mr. Caldwell will still face charges for his criminal actions. Perhaps," Mrs. Patterson said pleasantly, "or perhaps the territorial governor will be interested to learn how his appointed officials have been manipulating territorial law to persecute citizens who have committed no actual crimes." Blackwood leaned close to Thornfield, and the two men held a whispered conference that grew increasingly heated as the conversation continued. Finally, Thornfield raised his voice to address the assembled crowd. "Very well. Given the medical circumstances, we will defer transport of the women until after their deliveries. However, this property remains under territorial oversight, and Mr. Caldwell will be restricted to the ranch pending resolution of charges against him." It wasn't a victory, but it wasn't a defeat either. They had bought time, preserved the family unit for now, and demonstrated that they weren't without allies or legal resources. As the territorial forces settled into positions around the ranch to maintain their oversight, Catherine realized that everything had changed once again. They were no longer guests in James's home. They were prisoners under guard, waiting for the births that would determine their ultimate fate. But as she watched the community members who had ridden to their aid, saw the determination in James's eyes, and felt Margaret's hand squeeze hers with quiet confidence, Catherine knew that whatever came next, they would face it as they had everything else, together, defiant, and absolutely refusing to surrender. The territorial forces made themselves at home with the casual arrogance of occupying armies. Soldiers pitched tents near the main house, established guard posts at every gate, and began treating the ranch as their personal domain. Blackwood commandeered James's study as his headquarters, while Thornfield took over the guest room that had once been intended for visiting friends. Catherine watched from her bedroom window as uniformed men rifled through the barn, the workshop, even Rosa's carefully tended garden, searching for evidence of wrongdoing that existed only in their imagination. The violation felt personal, intimate, as if strangers were pawing through the most private corners of her soul. "They're looking for something specific," Margaret observed from her own window. "This isn't random harassment. They have a plan." She was right. The soldiers moved with purpose, confiscating documents, questioning ranch hands with practiced efficiency, measuring and cataloging everything as if preparing for a formal trial. Whatever legal strategy Thornfield had devised, it required detailed evidence of the ranch's operations. Rosa knocked softly before entering with their evening meal. Her usual cheerful demeanor had been replaced by barely controlled fury at the invasion of her domain. "Pigs," she muttered in Spanish, setting down the tray with unnecessary force. "They demand I cook for them as if this were a hotel. They criticize my food, my housekeeping, even my English. But James says we must endure it. What does he plan to do?" Catherine asked. "Fight them in court if he can. Fight them with guns if he must," Rosa replied grimly. "But first we must get through the births. Dr. Henley says it could be any day. Now for both of you." As if summoned by the mention of his name, Dr. Henley appeared in the doorway carrying his medical bag. His usual jovial manner had been replaced by professional concern, mixed with obvious anger at the circumstances. "Ladies, I need to examine you both. The stress of today's events may have triggered early labor, and with soldiers camped outside, we need to be prepared for any eventuality." His examination confirmed Catherine's worst fears. Both twins were showing signs of imminent labor. Contractions had begun, though they were still irregular and relatively mild. Under normal circumstances, they would have days to prepare. But with territorial forces surrounding the ranch and legal threats hanging over their heads, normal had ceased to exist. "How long do we have?" Margaret asked. Hours, maybe less, Dr. Henley replied honestly. The stress has definitely accelerated things. I'll need to stay close and prepare Rosa to assist with the deliveries. That night, as the first serious contractions began, Catherine found herself thinking about the strange journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she and Margaret had been desperate women standing on an auction block, their futures entirely in the hands of strangers. Now they were about to become mothers in a house under siege, surrounded by people who had become family and threatened by forces that would tear that family apart. The contractions intensified throughout the night. By dawn, both twins were in active labor, their cries echoing through the house despite Rosa's attempts to muffle the sounds. Outside, the soldiers maintained their posts with professional indifference to the drama unfolding inside, paced the hallway like a caged animal, forbidden by propriety from entering the birthing rooms, but unable to distance himself from the sounds of struggle and pain. Diego had taken position near the kitchen, ostensibly helping Rosa with supplies, but actually serving as an armed guard against any attempt to interfere with the medical proceedings. It was Margaret who delivered first, just as the sun reached its zenith. Dr. Henley's shout of triumph brought tears to Catherine's eyes, even as her own labor intensified. Through the thin walls, she could hear her sister's exhausted laughter and the strong, angry cry of a healthy newborn. "A boy," Dr. Henley called out, "strong and perfect." But Margaret's ordeal wasn't over. True to Dr. Henley's predictions, she was carrying twins, and the second baby proved more difficult. Catherine listened to the sounds of struggle from the next room while fighting her own battle, each contraction bringing her closer to the moment that would change everything. Her daughter arrived, just as the afternoon shadows began to lengthen, entering the world with a fury that suggested she was already angry at the circumstances of her birth. Dr. Henley's hands were gentle but efficient as he cleaned and examined the baby, his smile the first genuinely happy expression Catherine had seen in days. "Perfect," he announced. "Absolutely perfect. 10 fingers, 10 toes, and lungs that could wake the dead." Through the wall, Catherine could hear Margaret's second child making similar protests about being ejected from the warmth and security of the womb. Dr. Henley moved quickly between the rooms, Rosa assisting with practiced efficiency despite the tension that filled the house. When it was over, when both mothers had been cleaned and settled with their children, an odd quiet fell over the ranch. The soldiers outside maintained their vigil, but even they seemed affected by the primal power of new life entering the world. James appeared in Catherine's doorway, his expression a mixture of joy, relief, and protective fury. His eyes went immediately to the tiny bundle in her arms, and something in his face softened in a way that reminded Catherine of the photograph she'd seen of him with Martha. "She's beautiful," he said quietly. "They all are. Margaret has 2 sons, Michael and Patrick. She's calling them Irish names for Irish fighters." Catherine looked down at her daughter, trying to decide on a name that would capture both hope and defiance. "Sarah," she said finally. "Sarah Caldwell." James's head snapped up in surprise. "Catherine, you don't have to." "Yes, I do. You've been the only father she's known, the only family we've had. If these people want to tear us apart, let them explain to a territorial court why they're separating a man from his daughter." The legal implications were staggering. By claiming James as the father, Catherine was creating a blood relationship that would complicate any attempt to separate them. It was a desperate gambit, but it was also a declaration of loyalty that went beyond mere gratitude. Outside, they could hear renewed activity as the soldiers responded to orders from their commanders. Voices carried through the windows, Thornfield demanding to know the status of the births, Blackwood organizing what sounded like preparations for departure. "They're planning something," James said grimly. "Whatever legal strategy they've devised, the births were the trigger they were waiting for." Mrs. Patterson arrived that evening, somehow managing to negotiate her way past the military guards through sheer force of personality and social position. She brought congratulations, practical supplies for the new mothers, and most importantly, news from the outside world. The territorial governor is growing uncomfortable with the situation here, she reported, settling into a chair beside Catherine's bed with the air of someone preparing for a long conversation. Too many influential people are asking questions about why military forces are occupying a private ranch. What kind of questions? James asked. The kind that suggest territorial officials may have overstepped their authority in pursuit of personal grudges, Mrs. Patterson replied with satisfaction. It seems that several prominent ranchers have contacted the governor's office expressing concern about the precedent being set here. Catherine felt a flicker of hope for the first time in days. Does that mean they might withdraw? It means they're under pressure to produce results quickly or face questions about their motives, Mrs. Patterson explained, which makes them more dangerous, not less. Desperate men take desperate actions. As if to prove her point, Thornfield appeared in the doorway with 2 armed soldiers flanking him. His expression was that of a man who had run out of patience with legal niceties. Mrs. Patterson, your visiting hours are over. Mr. Caldwell, I need to speak with you privately. Anything you have to say can be said in front of my family, James replied firmly. Very well. The territorial governor has reviewed the evidence we've gathered and authorized immediate action. At dawn tomorrow, Catherine and Margaret O'Sullivan will be transported to Phoenix to serve their lawful indenture contracts. The children will remain here under territorial custody until suitable arrangements can be made for their care. The announcement hit the room like a physical blow. Separating newborn babies from their mothers was beyond cruelty. It was barbarity disguised as legal procedure. Judge Thornfield, Dr. Henley said with deadly calm, separating nursing mothers from newborn infants constitutes medical malpractice. I will not permit it. Doctor, you are not in a position to permit or forbid anything. These women are bound. Servants who have fulfilled their reproductive obligations. The children can be wet nursed by more suitable caretakers. Catherine clutched her daughter closer, feeling the baby's tiny heartbeat against her chest. After everything they had endured, everything they had overcome, it was going to end with this ultimate cruelty. Children torn from their mothers before they had even learned their faces. But James stepped forward with an expression that made even the armed soldiers take an involuntary step backward. Thornfield, he said with a voice like winter wind, if you try to take these children from their mothers, you'll have to kill me first. And I promise you, that won't be as easy as you think. The confrontation hung in the air like smoke from a gunfight, with violence only a heartbeat away. Catherine realized that they had reached the moment of ultimate choice: surrender to legal tyranny or fight for what they knew was right. Regardless of the consequences. In her arms, baby Sarah stirred and made a small sound of protest, as if already sensing the battle being fought for her future. Catherine looked at her daughter's perfect face and made her own choice. Tomorrow will bring the final test. But tonight, she would hold her child and prepare for whatever sacrifice might be necessary to keep her family together. Dawn arrived with the sound of horses thundering toward the ranch. But these weren't the reinforcements Thornfield had been expecting. Catherine watched from her bedroom window, baby Sarah sleeping peacefully in her arms, as a new force of riders approached the territorial encampment at full gallop. At their head rode a man in an expensive suit with a distinctive silver star pinned to his vest, the territorial marshal, accompanied by what appeared to be federal officials and a contingent of U.S. cavalry. Behind them came a dozen local ranchers, Mrs. Patterson driving her buggy with determined precision, and surprisingly, 3 well-dressed women Catherine didn't recognize. The confrontation in the ranch yard was swift and decisive. The marshal dismounted and strode directly to where Thornfield stood with his mouth agape, clearly not expecting this development. Judge Marcus Thornfield, the marshal announced in a voice that carried clearly in the morning air. "You are under arrest for abuse of territorial authority, illegal seizure of private property, and violation of federal statutes regarding the treatment of citizens in territorial disputes." Thornfield's face went through a series of colors before settling on an unhealthy shade of gray. "Marshal Bradley, I am acting under direct orders from the territorial governor. You have no authority to interfere with official proceedings." "Actually, I do." Marshal Bradley produced a document from his coat with the flourish of a man who had been waiting for this moment. "Federal investigation into your activities has revealed a pattern of corruption, abuse of office, and personal enrichment through the manipulation of territorial law. You've been relieved of all official duties pending trial in federal court." "Colonel." Blackwood attempted to intervene, his hand moving toward his sidearm. "Marshal, my men are here under territorial authority. We won't stand down without proper documentation." One of the well-dressed women stepped forward with the kind of confidence that commanded immediate attention. She was perhaps 50, with silver-streaked hair and intelligent eyes that missed nothing. "Colonel Blackwood, I am Eleanor Roosevelt, representing the National Women's Suffrage Association. We have been monitoring this situation with great interest." Her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to dealing with powerful men. "Who underestimated her? The federal government has received extensive documentation regarding the persecution of the O'Sullivan sisters, and President Cleveland himself has ordered a full investigation." Catherine felt her world tilt on its axis. Eleanor Roosevelt, the wife of the future president, though Catherine couldn't know that, had somehow become involved in their case. How had their small struggle attracted such attention? The answer came from Mrs. Patterson, who approached the house with a smile of pure satisfaction. "My dear," she said to Catherine as she climbed the porch steps, "did you really think the territorial governor could suppress this story indefinitely? When prominent citizens start disappearing into military custody without proper legal proceedings, word reaches interesting places." Behind her came one of the other women who had arrived with the federal officials, a younger woman with a notebook and the intense expression of someone recording history as it happened. "Miss O'Sullivan, I'm Rebecca Morrison from the Eastern Women's Journal. We've been following your story for weeks. The illegal auction, the military occupation, the threat to separate nursing mothers from their newborn children. This has become a symbol of everything wrong with territorial administration." Catherine stared at the woman in amazement. "Our story is in Eastern newspapers?" "Your story, my dear, has reached Washington, D.C., Mrs. Roosevelt interjected as she joined them on the porch. "When we learned that territorial officials were threatening to separate babies from their mothers in pursuit of personal vendettas, it became a matter of national concern." Through the window, Catherine could see the confrontation in the yard reaching its climax. Thornfield was being placed in handcuffs while Blackwood argued futilely with federal officials who clearly outranked him. The territorial soldiers looked confused and increasingly uncomfortable as their legal authority evaporated around them. James appeared in the doorway, his expression a mixture of relief and bewilderment. "Catherine, they want to speak with you, all of you. Something about testimony for a federal investigation." What followed was the most surreal morning of Catherine's life. Sitting in her own parlor, holding her newborn daughter, she found herself giving testimony to federal investigators about territorial corruption while newspaper reporters took notes, and Eleanor Roosevelt asked pointed questions about the treatment of women in frontier communities. Margaret joined them when she felt strong enough, carrying baby Michael while Rosa held Patrick. The sight of the twin mothers with their newborn children provided a powerful visual that Rebecca Morrison captured in detailed, written descriptions that would appear in newspapers across the country. "The fundamental issue here," Mrs. Roosevelt explained to the gathered officials, "is whether territorial governments can ignore federal law when it comes to the treatment of citizens, particularly women and children. This case has become a test of whether justice exists on the frontier, or only the arbitrary exercise of power. Marshal Bradley, who had been taking detailed notes throughout the proceedings, looked up from his paperwork with obvious concern. "Mrs. Roosevelt, the evidence we've gathered suggests this goes far beyond personal corruption. There's evidence of a systematic effort to seize valuable properties through the manipulation of moral statutes." "What do you mean?" James asked. "We've identified at least 12 other cases where prominent ranchers or successful businessmen were targeted for harassment after refusing to sell their properties to Eastern investment groups. The pattern is always the same: find some excuse to claim moral corruption, bring territorial pressure to bear, force the sale of property at below market prices." Catherine felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. The cattle raid, the investigation, the legal technicalities. This was never really about us, was it? "Oh, it was about you," Marshal Bradley replied. "But you were also the means to an end. Your presence here gave them the excuse they needed to move against Mr. Caldwell's property." James's expression darkened with understanding. "How much of my ranch were they planning to seize?" "All of it eventually. The corruption charges would have resulted in forfeiture of your federal land grants. The water rights alone are worth more than most men see in a lifetime." The scope of the conspiracy was breathtaking. What had seemed like personal persecution was actually part of a coordinated effort to steal valuable frontier properties through the abuse of territorial law. Dr. Henley arrived as the federal officials were concluding their interviews, bringing news that completed the picture of corruption they had uncovered. "I've just come from town," he reported, his usually jovial manner replaced by anger. "Thompson has disappeared, fled in the night apparently. Left behind financial records that show payments from something called the Southwest Development Corporation for Consultation Services. Eastern investors," Mrs. Roosevelt said with grim satisfaction. "We've been tracking their activities across 3 territories. They identify valuable properties, then use corrupt local officials to create legal justifications for seizure." Rebecca Morrison looked up from her notes with obvious excitement. "This is going to be front-page news in every major newspaper. Territorial corruption, federal intervention, the persecution of new mothers. It has everything readers care about." Catherine realized that their private struggle had become something much larger, a symbol of frontier justice, women's rights, and the battle between local corruption and federal authority. It was both thrilling and overwhelming to discover that their fight for survival had attracted national attention, but there were still practical matters to resolve. Thornfield might be under arrest, but the legal questions about their status remained unanswered. Marshal Bradley addressed this concern directly. "Ladies, the federal government recognizes that you were victims of illegal activities by territorial officials. Your original indenture contracts have been declared null and void due to the corruption of the officials who enforced them. You are free citizens with all the rights that entails." Margaret smiled for the first time in days. "And our children are legitimate citizens of the United States, entitled to all protections under federal law," Mrs. Roosevelt added firmly. "No territorial official will ever again have the authority to separate you from them." James had been quietly listening to the proceedings, but now he stepped forward with the determination Catherine had learned to recognize. "Marshal Bradley, I want to make something clear. These women and their children are welcome on my property, for as long as they choose to stay, not as servants or dependents, but as family members with equal rights to the land and its resources." Mrs. Roosevelt's eyebrows rose with interest. "Mr. Caldwell, are you proposing to formalize that arrangement legally?" James looked at Catherine and Margaret, his blue eyes holding a question he was afraid to ask directly. "I'm proposing that we become what we've already been in practice, a family bound not by conventional marriage but by choice, mutual respect, and shared commitment to raising these children together." The proposal was unconventional by any standard, but Catherine found herself considering it seriously. They had created something unique here, a household based on equality rather than traditional hierarchy, a partnership that transcended normal social boundaries. Such an arrangement would need legal protection, Rebecca Morrison observed. Something that couldn't be challenged by future territorial officials or social conservatives. Mrs. Roosevelt smiled with the expression of someone who had found an opportunity to advance multiple causes simultaneously. Actually, there's precedent for exactly this kind of arrangement. Communal property ownership, shared child-rearing responsibilities, legal partnerships that extend beyond traditional marriage. The federal government has been quite supportive of such arrangements when they serve the common good. What emerged from the discussions that followed was a legal framework that had never been attempted before, a formal partnership that would make Catherine, Margaret, and James equal owners of the ranch property, with all children considered heirs regardless of biological parentage. It would serve as a model for other unconventional frontier families and provide legal protection against future challenges. The papers were drawn up that very afternoon, signed in the presence of federal officials, newspaper reporters, and community members who had gathered to witness the historic moment. Catherine found herself signing documents that made her not just a property owner, but a pioneer in a new kind of family structure. As the federal officials prepared to depart, taking the arrested territorial officers with them, Mrs. Roosevelt took Catherine aside for a private conversation. "My dear, you must understand that this case will make you famous whether you want to be or not. There will be speaking invitations, interview requests, people who want to use your story for their own purposes." "I never wanted to be famous," Catherine replied honestly. "I just wanted to survive, to raise my daughter in peace." "And you've done more than survive. You've changed how people think about family, about women's rights, about justice on the frontier. That's a responsibility as well as an achievement." As evening settled over the ranch, Catherine found herself on the front porch where this entire journey had begun months earlier. The territorial forces were gone, replaced by a peaceful quiet that felt almost surreal after weeks of tension. James joined her, carrying baby Sarah with the natural competence of a man who had discovered an unexpected talent for fatherhood. Margaret appeared with her twin sons, the boys sleeping peacefully despite the day's excitement. "So," James said quietly, "we're officially a family now. Legal documents and everything. Were we ever anything else?" Margaret asked with a smile. Catherine looked around at the ranch that had become their home, at the people who had become her family, at the children who would grow up knowing that they belonged to something larger than conventional definitions of kinship. "No," she said softly, "we were always a family. We just made it official." In the distance, she could see lights beginning to appear in the windows of neighboring ranches, families gathering for their evening meals, children being tucked into bed with stories of the day's adventures. But their family was different, forged in struggle, tested by persecution, and ultimately validated by their refusal to surrender to forces that would have destroyed them. The babies stirred as if sensing the contentment of their mothers, making small sounds of comfort rather than distress. These children would grow up knowing that they had been born into a family that fought for justice, that stood against corruption, that proved love could take many forms and still be real. Rebecca Morrison's article would appear in newspapers across the country, inspiring other unconventional families to formalize their arrangements and seek legal protection. Mrs. Roosevelt would cite their case in speeches about women's rights and frontier justice. The federal investigation would lead to reforms in territorial administration that prevented similar abuses for generations to come. But sitting on the porch that evening, watching stars appear in the vast western sky, Catherine wasn't thinking about their place in history. She was thinking about tomorrow's breakfast, about teaching Sarah to walk, about watching Michael and Patrick learn to ride horses, About growing old in this place that had given them all a second chance at happiness. The transformation was complete. They had gone from being property sold at auction to being property owners, from being victims of corruption to being symbols of justice, from being desperate strangers to being an unshakable family. The journey had cost them everything they thought they knew about themselves, but it had given them something infinitely more valuable, the knowledge that they could survive anything as long as they faced it together. Outside the fence line, the desert stretched away toward mountains that caught the last light of day like ancient promises. Inside the fence, 3 adults and 3 children had created something new under the stars, a family that would last long enough to change the West itself, 1 generation at a time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.